In the high, lonely mountains of Wyoming, a man could go years without seeing another soul. And Robert Boone, he liked it that way. He was a ghost here, a former soldier who'd traded the crack of rifles for the whisper of pine. The war had taken everything from him: his wife, his child, his belief in flags and causes. He'd come to this abandoned military station to bury his past, to let the silence swallow the screams he still heard in his sleep. But on a cold morning in the late summer of 1878, the silence screamed back. He awoke to a shape against his roofline, a silhouette, stark and wrong against the pale dawn. He stepped outside, the frost crunching under his boots like broken bones. And then he saw her, a blonde woman, hanging from the main ridge beam of his own cabin. Her feet dangled inches from the door, her hair a pale waterfall brushing against the words someone had burned into the wood below. Apache Lover. His stomach clenched into a cold, hard knot. He'd seen that kind of hate before. He'd seen what it did to people. Heart pounding, he moved closer, the smell of charred wood and something else. Something metallic, stinging the air. His hand went for the pistol in his coat, a reflex born of battle, but his fingers froze. Killing was a language he no longer wished to speak. He was close enough now to see the details. The pale skin, the dirt and dried blood on her cheeks. Her eyes were closed. She was a message, left for him, or for anyone who'd find her. A warning. But then he saw it. A tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Her chest rose, then fell. A shallow, ragged breath. She wasn't dead. Not yet. A jolt went through him, a current of disbelief in something else he couldn't name. He holstered his pistol and braced himself under her arms, cutting the rope with his knife. Her weight was nothing, fragile as a bird's. He slung her over his shoulder, the muscles in his back protesting a tenderness they hadn't felt in years. He started down the slope behind the cabin, heading for a hidden lean-to by the creek. The forest was holding its breath, the world still and quiet. And then the silence shattered. Crack, 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 gunfire. Not close, but not far either. Echoing through the pines, sharp and urgent. They weren't just leaving a message. They were making sure it was delivered. Someone knew she was still breathing. Someone was still hunting her. Robert tightened his grip, her faint pulse a frantic drum against his back. He didn't hesitate. He ran. Branches clawed at him. Stones skidded under his boots. Every step was a prayer. Every shadow a threat. He reached the lean-to, a rough shelter of branches and hide, and gently laid her down on a bed of furs. Her golden hair spilled across the dark pelts, a slash of sunlight in the gloom. He knelt beside her, lifting her chin. Her eyelashes fluttered. She took a single shaky gasp, a sound that was half life, half death. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know who did this. He only knew one thing. They had left her to die on his doorstep, and he would not let them have her. She burned with a fever for 2 days. Robert cleaned her wounds, bathed her forehead with cool spring water, and listened. She whispered only one name, over and over, a broken prayer in the dark. Toha. The name haunted the small cabin, clinging to the shadows like smoke. On the second night, she woke up screaming. Her eyes were wide with a terror that wasn't in the room. Her arms flailed, her hands clawing at her own neck, trying to tear away an invisible rope. Get away! Let me go! I'll die before you take me back! Robert moved fast, grabbing her wrists. His grip was firm, not harsh. A soldier's hold, meant to steady, not to break. You're safe, he said, his voice low and calm. You're not there anymore. She fought him, her body a whip of panicked strength, teeth clenched, legs kicking. She didn't see him. She saw ghosts. Then, with a sudden lunge, she twisted free and scrambled toward the fireplace, her hand reaching for the small axe he used for kindling. He caught her around the waist, pulling her back hard against his chest, her struggling form surprisingly strong. Don't, he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. Not like this. Not after you made it this far. For a long moment she just trembled. Her breath came in ragged, tearing sobs. Then, all the fight went out of her. She sagged against him, limp and exhausted, like a runner who'd just realized the finish line was a mirage. He loosened his hold, and she slowly turned to face him. Her voice was a cracked whisper. "Who are you?" "Name's Robert. Robert Boone. This is my place." You found me?" He just nodded. Her eyes fell, and she sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her chest as if trying to hold herself together. After a silence that stretched for a full minute, she spoke again, her voice barely audible. "My name is Annabeth. Annabeth Crawley." Robert went rigid. The name hit him like a physical blow. Crawley. He hadn't heard that name in 15 years, not since it was scrawled across the bottom of military orders. Orders that sent men, mercenaries mostly, into Apache lands with fire and lead. Orders signed by the Honorable Nathaniel Crawley, a plantation baron and cattle lord who spoke of purifying the borders and protecting his way of life. A man whose name was synonymous with blood. Annabeth didn't notice his reaction. She was lost in her own hell. "He's my father," she said, her voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Or he was. Robert said nothing. The air in the cabin felt thick, heavy. "I ran away," she continued, her voice gaining a tight, brittle edge. "Years ago, after the last time, I didn't just run, I followed someone. Toha." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a sad, beautiful thing. "He found me by the creek behind our land. I was bleeding. He said I wasn't the enemy, said no one's born one." "You loved him," Robert stated. "It wasn't a question." She nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. "We lived in the canyons, far from everyone. I learned his language. I wore his mother's beads. We were happy." Her voice broke. "Then they came for us, last winter. White men. Some I recognized from my father's ranch." She shook her head, as if trying to dislodge the memory. "They ambushed us. Toha. He died protecting me. I saw him fall. They just stood over him and laughed." "They took you," Robert said, his own voice hoarse. She raised her sleeve. Beneath the fading bruises were the angry red marks of burns, shaped like letters. "They called me a witch, an Apache Lover. Said I shamed my blood. They tied me to a horse and dragged me from town to town. A spectacle. A lesson." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Then they left me hanging on your door, to make sure no other girl ever tried to love a man like him again." Robert stared at her, his jaw so tight it ached. The fire hissed and popped, the only sound in the room. He realized his hands were balled into fists, his knuckles white. Her story wasn't just a story. It was an echo of campfires and smoke, of screams in a language his men had refused to understand. Annabeth's eyes were glassy with exhaustion. "You can hate me," she whispered, looking at the floor. "Everyone else does." He sat beside her, not too close, and stared into the flames. His voice, when it came, was as soft as ash. "I don't hate you." She looked at him then, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "You think I betrayed my kind?" "No," he said, finally meeting her gaze. His own eyes held a darkness she couldn't possibly comprehend. "I think the ones who say that have never seen what real love looks like." Her lip trembled. "I should have died with him." Robert reached for the fire poker, stirring the embers until they glowed bright orange. He spoke without looking at her. "You didn't. And that's not betrayal. That's survival. Only cowards fear a soul brave enough to love across a line drawn in the dirt." Annabeth stared at him, at this quiet, haunted man who spoke of bravery and love. And for the first time since her world had been burned to the ground, She lowered her face into her hands and let herself cry. That night, Robert didn't sleep. He sat outside under a sky full of cold, distant stars, a tin cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. He wasn't looking at the trees or the moon. He was seeing fire. 15 years ago, the flames had been higher than the tallest pine. The screams had been louder than a thunderstorm. He'd stood on a ridge, a soldier under orders, and watched as a peaceful Apache settlement was wiped off the face of the earth. His unit had been told to stand down, to observe. They weren't supposed to be an enemy. They were allies. But they were too close to the sprawling Crawley ranch, and whispers of white women visiting the village, of children with hair a little too light, were enough to light the torches. The men who did the burning weren't soldiers. They were ranchers, mercenaries, men paid by Nathaniel Crawley. When it was over, when the smoke had cleared, Robert had gone down to look for survivors. He hadn't found any, but he had found his wife, crumpled by the riverbank, a stray bullet in her chest, and his daughter, limp beside her, caught in the crossfire of a rich man's hate. They had only been visiting a midwife, a friend. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong company. The man who'd led that raid, the man who'd drawn the map and paid the bounties, was a fanatic named Clayton Raddick. He was Crawley's right hand, a man who preached that anyone who sympathized with the Apache, hybrids, lovers, friends, must be purged from the land. Robert had buried his family with his own hands, the dirt feeling heavier than stone. Then he had vanished into these mountains, taking a vow to never again raise a weapon, to never again be part of any war. Until now. The war had found him. It had been left hanging on his door. Inside the cabin, Annabeth slept, her breathing finally even. The fever was gone, but the nightmares lingered. The next morning, she was exploring the small cabin when her hand brushed against a loose floorboard. Curious, she lifted it. Underneath, wrapped in oilcloth, was an old military rifle. She pulled it out. It was heavy, well cared for. She brought it to him as he sat by the fire. "This is yours." He nodded, not looking at her. She turned it over in her hands, her fingers tracing the smooth wood of the stock. She squinted at the firing mechanism. "The trigger's gone. I removed it," he said, "the day I buried my daughter, left the metal in the ground beside her. It was a promise made to the dead, a vow no bullet could ever rewrite." "I don't shoot anymore." She stared at him, her eyes searching his. "Not even if they come back for me?" He didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, his face a mask of stone. She didn't press him. She just leaned the useless rifle against the wall and walked away, the weight of a battle she couldn't fight alone settling on her shoulders. That afternoon, Robert started working. Not on the cabin, but deeper in the woods, on a half-ruined hunter's hut he'd used years ago. He worked with a silent, focused intensity. He fixed the leaking roof, cleared the overgrown brush, and built a new, solid door from salvaged planks. He laid down fresh furs, rebuilt the fire pit, and even turned over a small patch of earth outside, planting the few potato sprouts and wild onions he had stored. He was building her a home, a space that was hers, a place where she could feel safe, not saved. When she found it the next morning, she stood in the doorway, her hand covering her mouth. She stared at the small, tidy shelter, at the promise of food growing in the dark soil. Healing wouldn't be fast, but here, it felt possible. She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You built this for me?" He gave a single curt nod. "I never asked you to. You didn't have to." She stepped inside, running a hand over the smooth wood of the new door. She sat on the edge of the fur bedding and looked out at the small garden, as if it held the answer to a question she was afraid to ask. Her shoulders began to tremble. A single silent tear rolled down her cheek, then another. It wasn't the wild, keening grief of her nightmares. It was the quiet, aching release of someone who hadn't felt safe enough to weep in a very, very long time. Robert didn't move closer. He didn't offer words of comfort. He just stood there, a silent guardian, and let her be. This wasn't about him saving her. This was about two broken people learning to survive. And for the first time in 15 years, the man who believed he had nothing left to give had given something more powerful than protection. He had given her peace. And in return, she had given him the first fragile bud of her trust. The wind in these mountains carried more than the scent of pine. It carried whispers, and whispers in towns like Dustwater spread faster than wildfire. Lies traveled even faster. Within days, the story had twisted and turned, becoming a dark legend. The Apache Lover, the Crawley girl, she wasn't dead. She was alive, and a mountain man was hiding her. The whisper finally reached the ears of Clayton Raddick. He was sitting in a smoky saloon 2 towns south, his dusty boots propped up on a table, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He was a tall man, with a face like cracked leather, and eyes as cold and dead as a winter sky. When a rider stumbled in, breathless, with news from the foothills, Raddick didn't even blink. "A flash of blonde hair," the rider gasped. "Near the old military station, and tracks. 2 sets. One's a man, the other, small, a woman's." Raddick slowly swung his boots off the table. His hand drifted down, resting casually on the butt of the unique, long-barreled revolver at his hip. A grin spread across his face, a cruel, ugly thing. "The ghost is walking," he drawled. "We should have burned her the first time. Let's finish it right." By nightfall, he had a posse of 6 riders. They wore no badges. They were just hard men with harder eyes. Men who shared Raddick's hatred of anything that wasn't pure, anything that crossed the lines he'd drawn in blood. Meanwhile, back up in the hills, Robert heard a different kind of message. A timid knock at his cabin door. He opened it to find a local trader, a man he sometimes bartered with, twisting his hat in his nervous hands. "Don't want no trouble, Boone," the trader stammered, his eyes darting toward the woods. "But you ought to know. There's a bounty, a quiet one, not on paper, paid in coin and cattle, for the head of the Crawley girl." The trader swallowed hard. I seen you with her near the creek. Figured you should know what's coming for you." He turned and practically ran back down the trail, disappearing into the trees. Inside the cabin, Annabeth had heard every word. Before Robert could even speak, she was packing her few belongings into a small cloth bundle. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady. "I have to go. They'll kill you if they find me here." "They'll kill you if you go," Robert said, his voice flat. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a desperate fire. "You saved my life once. I won't let you die for it." Robert took a deep breath, the cold mountain air filling his lungs. He stepped toward her. "I lost my wife and child because I stood still," he said, his voice low and intense. "I watched a fire burn everything I loved and I did nothing. I called it fate. I called it orders. It was cowardice." He looked directly into her eyes. "I won't do that again." She opened her mouth to argue, but he cut her off. "You're not a burden. You're not a thing to be hidden. You are a person, and I am done letting men like Raddick and your father decide who is worthy of drawing breath." Her shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of her, but her gaze never left his. "They'll come." "I know," he said. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Let them." That night, Robert went into the woods alone. He moved like a creature of the forest, a shadow slipping between the trees. He hadn't been a soldier in years, but the instincts were still there, buried deep. He wasn't preparing for a gunfight. He was preparing for a hunt. He laid traps. Not killing traps. Slowing traps. A tripwire made of old tins that would rattle and clang. A deadfall branch, carefully balanced to block the main trail. A silent perimeter of warnings. A web of his own making. When he returned to the cabin, the sky was just beginning to bruise with the first light of dawn. Annabeth was waiting for him, sitting by the dying fire. a mug of tea held tight in her hands. "You could have run," she said quietly. "I could have," he agreed, his voice rough with fatigue. "Why didn't you?" He looked at her then, a long, searching look. "I've seen men fight to own things, to possess people, to put them in chains. That's not why I'm here." "Then why?" she whispered. He set his hand on the rough wooden table between them, his calloused fingers just inches from hers. "I just want you to live." Her throat tightened. No one had ever said that to her before. Not her mother, not her father, not even Toha. People had wanted her to be dutiful, to be beautiful, to be quiet, to be theirs. No one had ever simply wanted her to breathe. And in that moment, in the quiet of the pre-dawn mountain cabin, Annabeth Crawley stopped feeling like someone on the run. She felt seen. Outside, the forest was still. But beyond the ridge, hoofbeats were getting closer. The war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The wind changed after sundown. Robert felt it in his bones before he heard it in the trees. A tension in the air, a stillness that was louder than any sound. He rose from his cot, his movements fluid and silent, and slipped out of the cabin. He checked his perimeter. 3 of his warning traps had been tripped. No sound, no shouts. Just a cut wire here, a displaced stone there. Someone had passed through. Someone skilled. Someone who knew how to move without being seen. They were professional. They were Radix men. He returned to the cabin, his face grim. Annabeth looked up from the fire, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't need to ask. His expression said it all. "They're here." He nodded once. "Stay inside. No lights, no sound." She stood up, her jaw set. "I can help." "I need you alive," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "More than I need your help." And then he was gone, melting into the darkness as if he were part of it. 3 of Radix's men crept through the woods. They moved with the arrogance of predators, carrying knives, ropes, and a bottle of kerosene. They whispered and chuckled as they approached the small, rebuilt hunter's hut where they assumed Annabeth was hiding. "Bet she's pretty when she begs," one of them sneered. "Easier to string up if she's half dead anyway," another laughed. They never saw Robert. He dropped from the low-hanging branch of a massive pine, landing silently behind the last man. An elbow to the throat, a quick, precise strike to the wrist holding the knife, and the man crumpled without a sound. The second man heard the faint thump and turned, his eyes wide. He only had time to register surprise before Robert's fist connected with his jaw, a brutal, efficient punch that sent him sprawling. But the third man, the one with the kerosene, saw the movement. "He's here!" he shouted, drawing his revolver. The quiet forest exploded with the crack of gunfire. Back at the main cabin, Annabeth heard the shot. She froze for a heartbeat, her blood turning to ice. Then, a desperate, wild idea sparked in her mind. She grabbed the oil lantern, a flint, and ran for the door. Outside, Robert moved like a cornered wolf. He dodged and weaved, using the trees for cover. But these men were good. 2 against 1, with blades and a gun. He was faster, but they were closing in, their knives glinting in the moonlight. And then the moon was gone. A new light bloomed in the forest, a sudden, terrifying wall of orange and gold. Flames roared up the dry underbrush, leaping from bush to branch with an explosive whoosh. Annabeth hadn't just started a fire. She had created a barrier, a moving wall of destruction. Heat and smoke poured through the trees, a hellish breath that blinded and choked Radix's men. They turned, shouting in confusion and fear. Robert seized the moment. He moved in fast, a blur of motion. A sharp kick broke one man's leg. He dragged the other to the ground, a chokehold silencing his shouts. Then he fled, not away from the fire, but toward it. Because that's where she was. He found her near the base of a rocky ridge, her dress singed, her face smudged with soot. She held a burning branch in her hand like a defiant torch. When she saw him, she didn't speak. He grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a narrow ravine trail he knew. They ran, lungs burning, the roar of the fire at their backs, until they reached the dark mouth of an old cave hidden in the canyon wall. Inside, the air was cool and still. They collapsed onto the dusty floor, gasping for breath, their skin covered in ash. He reached out, gently brushing a lock of hair from her face. The ends had been singed, curled into a brittle black line. "You set the woods on fire," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. There was no anger in it, only awe. "Just a little," she rasped, a weak smile touching her lips. "You could have died." She met his gaze in the darkness, her eyes reflecting the distant glow of the flames. "I know." He paused, his fingers still tangled in her burnt hair. He had to ask. "Would you have died for me?" Annabeth swallowed, the question cracking open something deep inside her. For a long moment she was silent. Then she whispered, her voice shaking with an emotion he couldn't decipher. "No, I want to live for you." The cave was silent, save for the sound of their breathing and the distant crackle of burning pine. But a different kind of fire had just been lit between them, and this was one they wouldn't run from. The town of Dustwater was a place built on secrets, where gossip moved like shadows in the afternoon sun. Robert hadn't set foot on its dusty main street in 15 years, but now he stood in the back of the trading post, the brim of his hat pulled low, and listened. "Clayton Radish is coming," one man said, leaning against a barrel of nails. "Riding in by the end of the week. Got business with the mayor, they say." "Personal business," another man muttered into his beer. "Heard he's hunting again." Robert's body went tense. He turned and walked out, the little bell over the door tinkling mockingly behind him. Annabeth was waiting at the edge of town in a rickety wagon they'd borrowed, a hood drawn over her blonde hair. Her eyes scanned every passing rider, every glint of metal. When Robert returned, she didn't look at him. She just stared straight ahead. "It's him, isn't it?" "Yes." She reached into a small satchel and pulled out a piece of scorched, tanned leather. It was the piece that had been nailed to his door, the one with the brand seared into it. Apache Lover. In the harsh sunlight, she ran her finger over the blackened letters. "Robert," she said, her voice tight. "Look at this. The way the A is angled, the loop on the P. This wasn't done with a branding iron stamp. This was written, by hand, with a hot poker." "You recognize it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. She nodded, her eyes hard as flint. "Radek used to send letters to my father. Demands, threats. They hated each other, but they shared a common enemy. My father used gold to get what he wanted. Radek used fire." Her voice cracked. "He sent one to Toha, too, a warning. Nailed it to the door of our winter camp. He called him a mud-skinned thief and threatened to hang him from the gates of this very town. He wrote it all in this same twisted script." She held the leather up, and for the first time, Robert saw that her hands were perfectly steady. He took it from her and stared at the seared word. Suddenly, something else caught his eye. A tiny mark, almost lost in the charring, right next to the last letter. It wasn't part of the word. It was a symbol, a circle with a jagged line through it. The insignia of Radek's old rogue militia unit. The Purifiers. "He's not just hunting us," Robert said, his voice a low growl. "He's signing his work." "He wants to erase them," Annabeth whispered. "He wants the world to forget anyone like Toha ever existed." Robert looked from the brand to her face, a new cold fire burning in his eyes. "Then we'll have to remind them. They had no army, no badges, no allies. But they had the truth. And Robert had a plan. Not a plan of bullets and ambushes, but of proof and words." That night, they slipped into the back of the town church. Annabeth remembered a letter her father had received from Radek, one he'd tried to burn. A letter boasting about his purification efforts and warning Crawley to control his wayward daughter. The church, it turned out, kept meticulous records of correspondence related to large donations, and Crawley had donated land to the church for a tax break. The half-burned letter was still there, filed away, forgotten. The threat, the slur, the unmistakable handwriting, and the purifier's insignia were all there. They took the letter. Next, they went to the new deputy's cabin on the edge of town. He was a young man, his face still free of the cynicism that lined the faces of the other town officials. Robert laid the evidence on his simple wooden table: the scorched piece of leather, the half-burned letter, and a faded photograph from his army days. It showed a line of soldiers outside a burning village. At the front stood Clayton Radek, tall and proud, with that unique long-barreled revolver at his hip. Robert told the deputy everything. He didn't ask for help. He didn't ask for trust. He just laid out the facts. "We're not here to start a war," Robert said, his voice even. "We're here to show you who already started one." The young deputy looked from the evidence to Robert's hard face, then to Annabeth's. He saw the truth in their eyes. He nodded slowly. "Radek arrives on Friday. He's meeting with the mayor on the courthouse steps. The whole town will be there." He took a deep breath. "People ought to know who they're letting into their homes." Annabeth stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "I don't need them to like me. I just need them to see me as a person, not a lesson." Robert looked at her, a flicker of pride in his chest. They were no longer running. They were no longer hiding. They were witnesses. The war wasn't over. But the silence was. Dustwater hadn't seen a crowd like this since the railroad came through. They filled the town square, drawn by the whispers that had become a roar. A mountain man back from the dead. The Crawley girl, alive. A showdown with the legendary Clayton Radek. They stood in the midday sun, hungry for a spectacle. Robert Boone stood on the courthouse steps, facing them all. Beside him, a nervous-looking mayor and a panel of town elders sat at a long table. Clayton Radek stood to the side, arms crossed over his chest, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked confident. He looked untouchable. "I have here," Robert began, his voice carrying across the silent square, "a letter, written by Clayton Radek to Nathaniel Crawley." He held up the half-burned paper. In it, he calls Annabeth Crawley a shame to her blood, and calls for the death of the man she loved. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Radek's smirk didn't waver. Robert then held up the scorched piece of leather. "And this, nailed to the cabin door where Annabeth was left to die, branded by the same hand, with the same slur." He paused, letting his eyes sweep over the faces in the crowd. "And the same signature." He pointed to the tiny, jagged symbol. "The mark of the purifiers." More murmurs. A few men shifted uncomfortably. Next, Robert produced the faded photograph. "This was taken 15 years ago, the night the Dustwater Creek settlement was burned to the ground." He pointed to the tall figure at the front. "And that is Clayton Radek's revolver. Custom trigger guard, double-checked hammer. One of only 6 ever made for the Wyoming militia." Radek finally spoke, his voice a mocking bark. "This is a circus. War stories from a half-mad recluse and a woman who betrayed her own family to lie with savages." His voice rose, booming across the square. "Are we to believe these two over a man who has dedicated his life to keeping these lands safe? She chose her side. She consorted with murderers." Some in the crowd nodded. Fear was a powerful weapon, and Radek wielded it like a blade. "What's next?" he roared. "Will we let them raise our children? Teach them their ways?" The tide was turning. Robert could feel it. He had the proof. but Radek had their fear. Then, a new voice cut through the tension. A quiet, raspy voice. I was there. Every head turned. An old man, bent and frail, shuffled out from the shade of the sheriff's office. He leaned heavily on a wooden cane, his face a road map of grief and cheap whiskey. He was the town doctor, a man most people dismissed as a drunk. He hobbled slowly toward the steps. I was the field surgeon for the militia, he said, his voice shaking but clear. The night of the raid. He stopped and looked directly at Radek. You gave the order. No quarter, no captives. You said you wanted the land washed clean. That was the night Robert Boone's wife and daughter died. Radek scoffed. The ravings of a dying drunk. The old doctor's eyes, red-rimmed and weary, suddenly burned with a cold fire. You buried your guilt in whiskey, Radek. I buried mine in silence, but only one of us still wakes up screaming from the smell of smoke. The mayor went pale. The square was dead silent, and then Annabeth stepped forward. She walked to the front of the platform, her head held high. She faced the crowd, her hands at her sides. Then, without a word, she turned her back to them and untied the laces of her blouse. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Her back was a canvas of healed and half-healed wounds. Long, twisted scars, raised like ropes, crisscrossed her skin. Wounds that no amount of time could ever fully erase. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft, but it carried to every corner of the square. These marks were not made by Apache blades. They were not made by savages in the woods. They were given to me by white hands, by so-called Christian hands, by men who said they were saving my soul while they destroyed my body. She turned back to face them, her eyes blazing. Toha did not chain me. He taught me how to find water in the desert and food in the rocks. He did not own me. He listened to me. And he died protecting me from men like him. She pointed a trembling finger at Radek. You didn't hang me to punish love, she said, her voice rising with every word. You did it because you're afraid of it. You did it to silence it. Silence. A heavy, profound silence hung over the town square. No one clapped, no one cheered. But in that moment, every single person in that crowd looked at Clayton Radek and saw him for what he truly was. A monster. The truth, spoken not with guns but with scars and memories, had finally found its voice. The fire of justice had not burned out. It had only just begun. Clayton Radek was not hanged by a mob. He was sentenced by the very laws he had twisted for his own purposes. The town of Dustwater, forced to look at the ugliness it had allowed to fester in its shadow, chose a quiet, legal justice. Words, not bullets. Truth, not vengeance. Robert and Annabeth didn't stay to see it. They left the next morning, riding out before the sun had even touched the peaks, heading back to the high country where a man's name mattered less than the strength of his hands and the truth in his heart. It took them 3 days to reach the ridge. The hunter's cabin was still standing, a silent testament to their survival. Robert set to work repairing the damage from their flight, his movements purposeful and calm. Annabeth gathered fresh pine needles for bedding and wild herbs for medicine. They worked together in a comfortable silence, rebuilding not just a shelter, but a life. Weeks turned into months. The small garden expanded. Robert built another room onto the cabin, his hands remembering the language of wood and nails. Annabeth painted the new door a bright, cheerful blue, using a paint she made from crushed wildflowers and ash. For peace, she said, her smile genuine and easy. And then, something unexpected happened. People started to come. First, a young boy, barely a man, cast out by his family for marrying a Cheyenne girl. Then, a woman with a brutal scar down her cheek, running from a past she wouldn't speak of. An old prospector whose claim had been stolen. A wounded horse left for dead by hunters. One by one, the outcasts and the broken found their way to the cabin on the ridge. It became a sanctuary. a place not of exile, but of acceptance. Robert watched it all, a slow, unfamiliar warmth spreading through his chest. The hole that had been carved out by grief 15 years ago was beginning to fill. One evening, as the sun bled red and gold across the mountains, he found Annabeth standing by the simple rail fence they had built, looking out at the valley below. He walked up beside her, his old hat in his hands. He didn't have flowers or pretty words. He just had the truth. "You don't have to say yes," he began, his voice a low murmur. "There's no ring, no preacher." He looked at her, his eyes steady and clear. "I just need to know," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "That you'll still be here when the sun comes up tomorrow." She turned to him, her expression soft. She reached out and rested her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Toha," she said, her voice a whisper, "was the lightning. He broke down the door to my cage. He taught me how to burn." She reached up and gently touched the rough stubble on Robert's cheek. "But you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You are the stillness after the storm. You taught me that love doesn't have to be a fire to be real. It can be the quiet sound of a floorboard creaking in the night, the warmth of a shared blanket." Robert closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against hers. She whispered, "He was my first love. But you, Robert Boone, you are my last." They were never married by law or blessed by a church. Their vows were unspoken, written in the way they moved around each other, in the shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire. Months later, the new school teacher in Dustwater found a letter tucked inside a donated book. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was elegant and strong. "I was once loved by a warrior who held my heart like a bright, sharp blade. Now I am loved by a man who holds it like soil, soft, steady, and strong enough to grow something new. One taught me how to fight, the other taught me how to heal. I have learned that love is not proven in how loud you scream, but in how long you stay after the echoes have faded. He is not my savior, he is not my captor, he is simply the man who stayed. And that is more than enough. In a land carved by violence, two broken souls found something more precious than gold and more powerful than revenge. They found peace." Their story was never written in a history book, but it lives on in the blue wildflowers that bloom on the ridge every spring, a testament to a love that was brave enough to cross any line and strong enough to build a home in the wilderness. If this story of a love that healed the deepest of wounds touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe. Join us again for more stories where the silence of the frontier is broken by the beat of two hearts finding their way home. Because out here, every scar tells a story, and every love leaves a trail.